All right, so I want to make sure we have all of our time for this session, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome back. My name is Nicole Jerger. I'm the Associate Director for CTE at the Community College Board, and I will be the moderator for today's session. This breakout session is utilizing data to advance equitable outcomes in small CTE programs of study, and this is presented by OCCRL, specifically Marcy Rocky, Colvin Georges Jr., and Jason Keist. As a reminder, all participants on this session are in listen-only mode. Please post your questions and/or comments in the chat box, and we will address them at the end of the session. You can also use the Q&A portion. This session will be recorded. The presentation recording and any materials presented during today's session will be available on the Whova app throughout the conference. Following the conference, these materials will be available on the Forum for Excellence webpage that I'll post in the chat. So like I said, I'd like to introduce Marcy Rocky, Colvin Georges Jr., and Jason Keist as our presenters today. And thank you for taking the time to present for us. And I will turn this over to Marcy.
Thank you. Let me get our slides up, and I will turn it over to Jason to kick us off.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everyone for coming in. Again, my name is Jason Keist. I'm a research associate at OCCRL. You can go to the next slide. So first off, a little bit about what we do at OCCRL. We study policies, programs, and practices designed to enhance outcomes for diverse youth and adults who seek to transition to and through college to employment. And down here we have our 4 buckets, or our 4 pillars that constitute our scope of work. That involves public engagement, transformative leadership, equity-driven change, and comprehensive P20 educational pathways. I'll take this time for a second, at least, to say that our website houses an abundance of diverse scholarly work in the form of research briefs, videos, podcasts, and webinars. Go to the next slide. All right, so what prompted this presentation was a participatory evaluation study completed about 2 years ago. OCCRL framed the study around the concept of program review as a tool for supporting student-centered, equity-minded, and evidence-driven change at Illinois community colleges. This particular study focused on providing formative feedback to the Illinois Community College Board, or ICCB, with the intent to improve the efficacy of the CTE program review process. We had 49 practitioners actually who participated in the study. We collected data during 3 separate events. First 2 events were focus groups, and the last event was involved design challenges informed by the previous focus group. All this resulted in about 19 hours of audio recordings. So the whole goals of our study was to identify challenges, redundancies, and omissions, and providing recommendations for refining the process. The second piece is examining variations of the program review process across institutional contexts and identities, recognizing that no 2 institutions are the same. And we were seeking also to identify professional development, tech support, and supplemental materials that could improve outcomes associated with program review. And lastly, as you can see, we sought to enhance the application of program review findings in colleges' campus level, programmatic planning, and decision-making processes. It's important to understand from here that program review is a tool for continuous program improvement. It is not the end goal. This understanding will be reiterated throughout the presentation. Let's see, particular to the 2017-2021 Program Review Manual is the inclusion of specific questions about disaggregation of program level data to reveal potential inequities. So at the last of 3 events, as I mentioned before, we created design challenges for participants to complete. And then again, this was informed by their feedback from the first 2 focus groups. One of the 5 challenges identified by participants revolved around using disaggregated data to identify equity gaps. And one of the quotes from the reports is what you can see here. Participants highlighted that relying solely on quantitative data, especially in small programs, as indicators of equity and inequity is limiting, and that a more balanced approach may reveal added nuance and equities and more readily lead to effective resolution. So what might a more balanced approach look like? Well, we will explore multiple alternative means of identifying educational inequities outside of numerical data throughout the remainder of this presentation, okay? So for this time, we would greatly appreciate your feedback early in the morning here. If you would use the chat box to indicate what does a small program look like, what it would be like in your institutional context. We're curious to know not just how many students would be enrolled in this program study, but also if you too have had difficulty assessing potential equity gaps within small programs of study. You can just use the chat box if you would. I'll come over here and see. So what would a small program be like at your institution? Okay, we have one. 15 or below be considered a small program for institution. Okay, gotcha. $15 freshmen and 15 sophomores, so 30, and that would be considered a small program, the 30 students, Patty was saying? Okay. So we're getting about 15 students, we're saying. I've heard different institutional contexts, 8 students. We're looking at possibly 30 students here as a small program. The whole basis of this presentation really is that equity is still important to understand and consider, even within these small programs of study. 2 full-time faculty, that's fine. Oh, wow, okay. It sounds like a decent ratio to me. I think of 15 students per faculty. That's orthotic. Okay. All right. So I want you to keep these, and those of you who may not have put anything into the chat, 10 to 15 per semester. Oh, okay, good. No, I'm glad you can see now, Sarah. Yeah, we can talk about per semester. And depending on how long the program is, or how many semesters students have to completion, it'll be something to consider. So Karen, if you wish 15, how many do you actually have? If you wouldn't mind sharing. Okay. So I don't know how y'all feel. We can kind of move forward and talk about equity within these smaller programs of study, or any program of study really when it gets down to it. So we ask ourselves, what's an indicator of equity? What does an equitable program actually look like? As stated here, an equitable program will provide every student with what they need to succeed. If this is the case, though, we can say that certain programs of study would not be homogeneous with regards to race and or gender, first language, et cetera, because all students who entered that program would be supported in ways that are meaningful and useful to them. An equitable program would produce data that aligns more so with the picture on the right. In other words, equitable programs are built and sustained with everyone in mind, especially those students historically underrepresented within programs. We can't just quote, build it and they will come, per se. In reality, if the program isn't built for them in the first place, they won't enroll and or persist to completion. Additionally, if students from certain demographic backgrounds are not completing the program, it should be pretty apparent that the program is not operating with their needs in mind. Okay. All right, we'll go to the last slide. Okay, so well, last slide for me. Lastly, for the study, we were also interested in assisting participants in reflecting on how their colleges use evidence in decision-making. Okay, we understood that a culture of evidence positively affects student outcomes, especially if evidence was filtered through an equity-minded orientation. In order for institutions to make equity-driven decisions, they must first have the capacity to do these things. Access data, that's existing data, collect data, analyze data, and interpret findings. But we know that not every institution has the capacity to work through these steps seamlessly. Okay, seamlessly. It may be more difficult for certain institutions than others based on the resources they have access to. Therefore, there must be college-wide intentionality and cooperation if programmatic decisions are to be made through an equity lens. Everyone has to be on board. Ultimately, though, what do we do with the data after these 4 steps are completed that you see on the screen? The final step, and this is the evidence use cycle we're referring to in our report. And the final step really involves utilizing the evidence to affect systemic change. It has to be actionable, right? So specifically, we ask ourselves, how do we communicate our findings to diverse stakeholder groups, as well as take action on and reflect upon what we've learned throughout the process? Okay.
All right, thank you, Jason. This is Marcy, and we're gonna review specific sections of the program review template, and we're gonna identify how you can approach equity regardless of the size of your program. And I do, the earlier conversation about, what does a small program look like? And, thinking about this by semester really is also making me think about the importance of regular review. So we know that we're required to conduct program review every 5 years, but particularly for a small program, if we're only looking at this data every 5 years, it's really going to be difficult to identify trends and also to evaluate whether or not the changes we've made are resulting in positive outcomes. So I just kind of want to, as we go into this thinking about small programs, the importance of, again, as someone was talking about, by semester, or, as Jason kind of mentioned, how long does it take a student to complete? Or how long would your goal be in terms of when a student should be completing? That it's really important that we're looking at this regularly, not just every 5 years. And I also wanted to point out that, from the work that we've been doing with the support of ICCB, that there is an annual review template available on ICCB's website that's been informed by our Program Review Advisory Council. And so again, when we think about best practices, especially in a small program of study, that if you're looking at this every semester, it's going to help you really identify trends versus, every 5 years. So kind of thinking about what do you have in place to annually or semester, each semester look at this data. So this is the section, of course, where, again, as we've interacted with practitioners, we see the word equity. So sometimes, I think people think, okay, well, this is where equity is, but we really, as we move forward, want to talk about how equity, really program review provides us opportunity to incorporate equity throughout, even though you may not see the word, equity. And I also want to note that, of course, as we're providing some professional development related to what people said in the Program Review Illinois study, we're really wanting to help people think through, what opportunities exist in your context. So we're not trying to, again, at OCCRL, we're supporting people. So we're not trying to tell people, the quote unquote right way to do program review, but we just want to help provide some professional development and guidance based on the feedback that we received during the study. So again, and Jason kind of talked about this, we don't want people to approach kind of what we're saying with this like compliance mindset or like we're doing it right. We just want to give you some opportunity to think about, reflect, how you might utilize program review as an opportunity to advance equity, especially in a small program of study. So again, we have our data here that we heard from people that, this is challenging with a small program to really identify trends. But again, you still have data that you can look at and use and report as it relates to really looking at, who's enrolled, who's completing. And so moving beyond that, the questions that are labeled under the performance and equity section, they're asking you what disaggregated data was reviewed. So again, even in a small program, you can name that. Were there gaps? You can explain and elaborate on that. And this is where, and we'll continue to talk about this, particularly in a small program, it might be beneficial to really, when you're thinking about this question, moving beyond the individual program, but how does it connect to overall institutional trends? Or even in this particular, particularly with CTE, the overall, employment area or career pathway. So, you can think about that as you're answering these questions. What is the college doing to overcome identifiable gaps? Again, how might overall college initiatives, provide connections to your actual program? Where do you see opportunities to connect to that? Are the students served in the program representative of the total student population? Even in a small program, you can answer that question and identify any differences. So again, as we think about historically, especially in CTE, and you all think about special populations, where do we see those homogeneous groups? And so again, thinking about it in terms of the culture, even of the occupation, and how that influences your own program. And also with, are the students served in this program representative of the district? And so that's where, again, we can talk about, and we will talk about, environmental scans and things like that. But even in a small program, you can really recognize, when I look at my district, do I see that this program has always been very homogeneous? Or what differences do I see between who's in my district and who's enrolling at the college? And how does that affect my program? And so at this point, we want to get some more feedback. So again, the chat box. And so if my colleagues could help kind of provide feedback, if anybody is able to put in the chat box. But, since again, our presentation here, we really want to talk about helping you all connect with each other too, about what we learned in our program review study and how we can engage practitioners across the state in learning from each other and identifying opportunities to be equity-minded in program review, even in a small program, when you think about outside of the required numerical data. So again, outside of what you're required to put in this section, if you could share what additional data is available to you toward completion of program review for an individual program of study. So if you have some experience or you have found data that you have used outside of this numerical data to answer these questions, if you could just provide some feedback, suggestions to all the participants and to us about, what additional data are you using to answer these questions? Or maybe you have data you wish you had. So again, that can even be something that, as you're going through the program review process, are there additional data sources that you are prioritizing that would be helpful to you to complete program review for an individual program of study? So I'm curious if we have any feedback.
Marcy, just to let you know there's some lag. I just typed something in about maybe 30 seconds ago and it's still loading. Oh, here we go.
Oh, okay. And if there's some lag, we can come back to this, towards the end too. But I'll give it a little bit of time if people are typing.
something Teresa had said, I don't know how long ago she said it, was something I was thinking about too. Like, what does it take for a class to make? Over at Parkland, we got 12 for the class to make, and that differs across institutions. So it's just differing institutional context. So.
Yeah, and I think, and even, and particularly with CTE, thinking about, I guess, how can you prioritize, and this kind of even goes to the comprehensive local needs assessment, where, I feel like that's an opportunity that, I guess, for example, I'm just thinking of maybe, you see that there's a viable area for employment, but if you're struggling with enrollment, like how can you, again, use the CLNA and how program review can even feed into that and try to prioritize, if a class isn't making, but you see that there's opportunity in the future for employment, or maybe, again, do you need to have conversations about whether or not the program is meeting the needs of employers? So there's just so many things to think about.
That's right.
And we can move forward and come back to this. But again, even in a virtual sense, we wanted to give people in this presentation in particular an opportunity to learn from each other. So please feel free to continue sharing in the chat box, especially those of you that feel like you've had success looking at different ways to use data in smaller programs of study and identify equity gaps. So we wanted to highlight a particular case study, if you will, to give you an idea of maybe just a resource you can look at, or just an example. Particularly because I know for our smaller community colleges, as a small college, again, as in a small program, you may find, you're reporting quantitative data, but you really need to look beyond that. And everybody needs to look beyond quantitative data, but it can be especially challenging as a small college or a small program to identify trends just in numerical data. So we wanted to share the work of Patrick Henry Community College in rural Central Virginia, which has been highlighted by Achieving the Dream. So they're an Achieving the Dream institution. And I'll just tell you a little bit about Patrick Henry Community College based on their IPEDS data. They have 2,200 students total, so small rural community college. Their racial demographics in terms of the largest three groups, they're 65% white, 19% Black, and 9% of students identifying as Hispanic Latino. And as many as 80% of their students require developmental education. And so they were highlighted by Achieving the Dream, and they worked with Achieving the Dream to move forward in data-based decision making. So again, even as a small community college, they were able to really cultivate a culture of data-based decision making, and specifically towards identifying larger equity gaps across the institution. So they utilized information from multiple sources, as this article cited here, which is linked in our slides. So they really started to look at student surveys and placement tests as part of their efforts toward data-based decision making. So again, this is where I think we see an example of, a small institution that really prioritized looking beyond what we might have to, report on, but how do we broaden what we're looking at to really identify trends, and then we can use those trends to inform our efforts at the program level. Or how does what we see at the program level influence what's going on in the broader institution? And so again, they were highlighted in a small context, how they were looking deeper into these patterns that they were seeing, especially when they saw, the role of placement in developmental education. So they really looked at that. And in doing so, they were able to really create some more targeted support and identify ways to help students be more broadly successful. But again, at an institutional level, especially in a small institution, is going to affect every individual program. So we just wanted to share that. And of course, I work, my own research is in rural settings. And so, just highlighting that, even, within a small institution, I know it's challenging to rely on quantitative, data solely, but how you can really look at things more broadly to inform your program level work and vice versa. And so we wanted to highlight their work, and also, again, you can link and look at their experiences in the article that we have cited at the end of the presentation. So when we think about moving beyond the numbers, and so again, we all know there's a lot of quantitative data. So we've sort of talked about, it's not just enrollment, right? It's not just completion, but it's also, you can look at, surveys, of student satisfaction. You can look at placement tests. So I guess, I do want to say, of course, when we say quantitative, there's a whole lot more than just reporting on enrollment and completion that informs your program review, and we know that. And again, this is where we want to highlight the importance of working as an institution to create a culture where we're moving beyond compliance, right? Because that's particularly going to be really meaningful in a smaller program. So we want to talk about qualitative approaches that are especially important for program evaluation as it's context specific. So just like, as Jason was talking about, and we know from working with community colleges and even the program review evaluation study, every institution is very unique. Everybody has a very unique district. And so context is really important. So understanding equity and context, it's going to be really helpful if you have qualitative data to do that. And so this quote from the article cited here, if we need to know why scores or other performances differ, or how we might improve performance over time, we must look beneath the scores by using qualitative approaches. And this really comes into play as we're thinking about root causes when we think about equity. So we want to avoid deficit explanation. So we want to avoid, just making the assumption that, first of all, sort of blaming the students that are experiencing the inequities instead of asking, what can our institution do better to serve the students experiencing inequitable outcomes? And I think particularly as we think about, the way in which the pandemic is impacting students in so many different ways, really, again, looking at what these root causes are that are creating obstacles, and how has our institution even, unintentionally set up barriers for students, and how do we change that? So again, with these qualitative approaches, we're moving into really understanding what are student experiences, and how can we learn from the experiences of students that are experiencing equity gaps to make changes to our institution. So of course, focus groups are just an example. And again, this comes from the literature on program evaluation and program review. But focus groups are especially useful for program evaluation. And so this would just be, an example of a qualitative approach or technique that could be used. Again, general background information, diagnose the potential for problems, and generate impressions of programs. So these are helpful, as this quote states, to interpret and add depth to previously obtained quantitative results. So, right, we can see from the quantitative data, maybe like, oh, enrollment's low, or completion is low, or, we see that students are maybe not transitioning out of a particular developmental education class in this particular pathway in large numbers. But that doesn't really tell us why, right? And we don't want to default to these assumptions or, again, placing blame on the students. We want to know and understand what the experience is and what can our institution do better. And the only way we can do that is to talk to the people that are impacted by it. So focus groups are a way to get this depth and get to these root causes. And we have so many examples. Again, some of you I know have been Pathways to Results teams, and we have a lot of briefs, and it's always interesting because time and again, regardless of the equity gap that Pathways to Results team focuses on, is that people often, they have they have a lot of stories when they're kind of finished the process of like, oh, well, I assumed that, for example, students in this particular age bracket would be the ones experiencing this barrier, and this is why. But when we actually talked to our students, we realized it was actually this other group of students in another age group, and they were having this particular barrier, and we didn't even think about that. So again, focus groups really are a way to get away from these assumptions, to get away from placing blame on the students, but to understand their experiences and also highlight things our institutions may be doing that we think are helpful, or maybe we've just always done, and we just didn't realize the impact on students. So we wanted to highlight focus groups as particularly useful. And this can go even beyond students into thinking about how do we engage with employers? How do we engage with our K-12 partners as we think about these pathways, or our adult education program, especially in those high wage, high demand programs that we know have viability.
Marcy?
And yeah.
Could I say something really fast about focus groups, just really quick?
Sure. Yeah.
Just the importance of finding a facilitator who can build rapport with the population that you're, speaking with, and build that sense of safety and trust so that students can divulge fully, their lived experiences. You know what I'm saying? That's it.
Yes. Thank you, Jason.
No problem.
Yes, that's very important. And that's, where, and we have some resources that we'll share even at the end. And in particular, Dr. Abrica, who has been an IR researcher and has done a webinar for us kind of thinking about that positionality. So, and as Jason said, we don't want just anybody to do a focus group. So when we think about this is where, and you can share in the chat box or not, but thinking about, who has expertise at your institution to be able to facilitate a focus group. And as Jason said in particular, how can you work to prepare people, especially if they're conducting a focus group where they may not share the same social identities or racial identities as the students that you need to talk to. And also, first of all, recognizing, again, the way in which, what are your faculty demographics and what are your student demographics? Because we know that those are disconnected. And that's, that is an issue, and that is an equity issue. And so talking about that and understanding that. So when you think about what resources are available to you to facilitate a focus group, think about who facilitators may be with expertise. And if you feel like you don't have the expertise, how could you get the expertise? How could you, identify someone that may be interested in training, or, if you are working with institutional research or effectiveness, and that may even, especially at a small institution, that may be like one part of your job. We know that people wear multiple hats. But if this is something, again, this should be something really important. And so when you think about overall equity gaps, what resources are available? And again, if someone needs training, how might you support them in getting that training so that they can inform your efforts? And what groups already exist that meet regularly that you can maybe network with and provide insight? And again, that goes beyond your campus. So for your program review, how are you engaging community organizations? There may be community organizations that have data, have resources, have training that might be helpful to you and interested in, what your program review is finding and the initiatives that you set moving forward. You might look at transfer institutions, even looking at, what transfer institutions may have graduate programs or opportunities to partner for experiential learning that can support the needs that you have, but maybe you don't have the time or expertise to do. K-12 partners, workforce partners. So even moving beyond your campus, if there's things you want to understand related to your program that are affecting, the district, and we know that, inequities are systemic. So who else might be interested in knowing and understanding the root causes here, and who also may be vested in addressing them? So this can go beyond, your campus to creating partnerships. Because again, we know, we don't all have significant resources in order to do this. And again, thinking about the importance of student voice. So we know that sometimes, and this quote comes from our colleague, Dr. Shante Thrill, who wrote a really great brief on the importance of student voice. So we know that oftentimes students are completely absent from the program review process. And again, if we're only really looking at this as, well, we have to report, enrollment numbers and completion numbers, that's not going to get us to understanding the student experience in a way that helps us prioritize changes that address equity. So how are we hearing from students? How are we considering their feedback and the way that they're experiencing this program? And so again, if we're looking at this from the standpoint of equity, whose voices need to be heard? So if we're only talking to students that are successful, that's not really going to give us insight into the students that are experiencing equity gaps or experiencing barriers. And again, how do the social identities of faculty and staff facilitators influence data collection? So are people trained in understanding their own positionality, in building trust, in being authentically committed to understanding student experiences and not denying the experiences of students? What kind of training and preparation is needed before engaging in students in conversations about experiences? So again, how are we prepared to listen and affirm student voice, and whose voices are we listening to and affirming, particularly if we're really interested in advancing equity and equitable outcomes. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Colvin. And I know, I've talked about in particular the section that is labeled equity, but even within this template, of course, ICCB provides opportunities to look at these questions in a really equity-focused way. So Colvin's going to talk a little bit about, larger opportunities for data that may influence program review, but also look at other questions throughout the template where we see, equity is definitely a piece of it. So I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you so much, Marcy. So as we continue discussing ways to advance equitable outcomes in small CTE programs of study, we came up with several potential opportunities at both the institutional level and program level, where you might capitalize on existing data collection to support the program review process. I know this list may seem a lot at a first glance, but we are not saying that you have to do all of these things at the institutional or programmatic level. These are just a few resources and opportunities that we think could help you throughout the program review process. Keep in mind that your programs will be influenced by your institutional environments. If you have a small CTE program, you will need to look beyond the scope of the program itself to identify if your goals are being met. If you are responsible for program review at your institution, ask yourself, what do I know about my institution? What strategic initiatives are there at the institutional level that focuses on equity, and how does that relate to my program? Let's take a look at campus climate assessment as an example. We know that when these assessments are conducted, it's primarily gathering data about student and/or employee experiences. However, do you center race as part of your assessment? Based on my experience working with other institutions of higher education, I've participated in campus climate assessments, and race is not considered. It's listed as demographic information, but not used as a way to inform practice paired with empirical research to understand the experiences of historically underrepresented student populations on college campuses. With the campus climate example, if your institution does this, and we highly encourage it, how can you use this information when responding to questions in your program review template? How are you using data opportunities to address pre-existing racial equity gaps on campus? What about student voice, as Marcy mentioned before, beyond course evaluations or input from adjunct faculty? Adjunct faculty are critical voices as well, as some programs are largely led by them and they have a deeper understanding of the programs themselves compared to senior leadership who may only read annual reports. These reports only give a snapshot of the issues and challenges within CTE programs of study. Additionally, we recognize that some campuses may have these resources ready available and some may not. For example, some campuses may not be collecting job placement information right now. However, it would be good to begin gathering this information and break it down based on race, gender, socioeconomic status, and any other relevant information to help you gain a critical perspective of the students enrolled in the program and adjust student services and curricula based on the student need and other feedback from the levels noted. Can we go to the next slide? So here we have gathered questions directly from the program review template. As you can see, equity is not explicitly stated in these questions, but it is a critical consideration in responding to them. To truly advance equitable outcomes in CTE programs, we need you to apply an equity lens throughout the program review process. When discussing past program review action, program leaders should be able to reference things that they have done since the last time they've conducted program review that relate to advancing equity. In terms of review team and stakeholder engagement, we want you to consider how you are speaking to stakeholders, including faculty and staff. Who else are you engaging in program review and who is missing? Think critically about this. Even though some programs may have a small percentage of women or Black students, their voices and experiences still matter, and should be included in your responses in some way based on the questions being asked. As for CTE program review analysis, we know that when thinking about the prerequisites of your programs, they have a lot to do with equity, but using an equity lens, you are able to identify equity gaps when looking at course placement and other tests to determine a student's path at the college. In our experience, we believe that course placement and testing are missed opportunities when identifying equity gaps. Next slide. Here are additional questions that we pulled directly from the program review template. As you can see, equity is not explicitly addressed in these questions, but again, we encourage you to utilize an equity lens when responding to all questions to ensure that you are thinking about, acknowledging, and committed to developing a program that meets the individualized needs of students. Case in point, in question 1.4, when looking at student recruitment, how are you using environmental scans, alumni outreach, or even information about job placement to ensure that students who would be historically overlooked and underrepresented are provided with opportunities to apply? Using an equity lens allows people holding some form of power to recognize how structural barriers, biases, stereotypes, and racism adversely affect the experiences of students, and rather than allowing these structural and institutionalized barriers to persist, they take action, and one way being is how these questions are answered. Next slide. This question in particular has a lot to do with equity. We want you to sit here for a minute and read the question to yourself. A few things that we want you to consider are: 1, how are you helping students overcome financial barriers? 2, who is experiencing financial barriers in order to participate in the program? These types of reflexive questions are critical, especially considering that we are in a global pandemic and so many students are unable to afford higher education, or some students had to prioritize paying for their children's education over their own. A person with an equity lens considers these lived realities. We are not saying that the institution can support every single student facing financial difficulty, but it is important that this information is documented and trends are identified. There may be opportunities for the institution to apply for grants or receive funding from certain agencies to support students with these circumstances. And this is just one example, but there are many others. Next slide. Now, for this section of the program review template, we wanted to highlight quality. While equity is not explicitly mentioned throughout this section, question 3.5 references a career pathway program. When we link to this information, we see that equity is central to the Illinois Common Career Pathways. When equity is not centered, particularly in program review, this can affect policy development and student services. Next slide. Same feedback as before. We would like for you to respond to all questions in the program review template using an equity lens. Next slide. When embedding equity throughout the program review process, it is essential that you recognize students' race and other aspects of their social identity. For example, in this particular question, looking at barriers encountered while implementing the program, your response should consider retention, placement, support services, course sequencing, etc. Are you considering how certain policies at the institution may harm racially and minoritized students? Case in point, when thinking about federal financial aid requirements, If a student is selected for verification and are unable to provide necessary documents by a particular deadline, they risk losing their funding and are unable to complete their program of study. Individuals without an equity lens would see this as a student issue because the student did not follow the rules and they missed the deadline, and there are consequences for rule breakers. However, a person that is equity conscious would take an inward look at the institutional policies and determine ways that the institution can help the student meet the requirements. Did the staff member consider that the student did not have access to the information being requested? What about students that are not in contact with their parents or guardians due to extenuating circumstances? Have you considered that some students may be undocumented and may not trust the process of providing financial information? In this example, the responsibility of ensuring student completion and success, respective to financial barriers, rests on the shoulders of the institution and can be incorporated into overall program review. Next slide. To wrap up, we wanted to highlight a couple of webinars for your reference. The first one, Pillars of Neutrality, is about how to engage students in focus groups, especially when you have different social identities, specifically racial identities, than your participants. How might you use positionality and reflexivity when engaging students in focus groups, especially when you are from a different social identity or racial identity? The second one, Perspectives from the Pipeline. This webinar really helps people to understand racial equity in a particular program of study. It's an example of understanding systemic racism in the context of an actual academic program and industry and how it's relevant to the experiences of people in those classrooms and careers. These resources are a way for people to understand how race is relevant and challenges you to think about racial equity in a particular career pathway. Then we have Program Review Illinois. On our OCCRL webpage, we have many resources that you can review. This PowerPoint will be accessible to you, as well as you'll be able to access the links on our references slide, which also includes information about Program Review Illinois. Next slide. And here you can see a list of the resources that we used to develop this presentation, and there are hyperlinks that you can click on that will take you directly to the page itself. Next. All right, and of course you can join our mailing list by subscribing using the link that's included in the PowerPoint there, and we'll be able to send you our newsletters and other upcoming events that we have. All right, and here's our contact information. Yeah, and now we'll open up for questions and answers.
And I will add, we do have a newsletter specific to Pathways to Results, which really has a lot of resources specific to program review. So I'll add that in too. If you aren't on our listserv, you can specifically subscribe to the PTR news, which really gets to this work that we're doing with PTR and Program Review Illinois.
All right, if you have any questions, please put those in the session Q&A or in the chat before we wrap up. All right, it doesn't look like we've got any coming in. So I want to thank you for attending this presentation, and thank you to OCCRL for putting this great presentation on. Please be sure to provide feedback on this session in the Whova app. You will see the rate as soon as you're done with this session and you leave the meeting, you will see the button where you can do this. So with that, I thank you. Brittany, do you have anything else?
Yeah, no, I just want to thank OCCRL for their great information. It appears in the chat that everybody was responding to it and really appreciated it. So thank you guys for taking the time to present this for us. And our next session and the last breakout session for the day to close out the forum will be at 11. So take your break and then come back and see us at 11.
Thanks, everybody.
Everyone.
Thanks, everybody.